Thousands of years after the first farming villages appeared, their stones and skeletons preserve an uncomfortable contradiction. Grinding slabs were polished by countless hours of repeated motion. Human joints record habitual strain. Teeth were worn by tiny fragments of stone that entered flour. The food that helped settlements endure also left marks on the people who produced it. Before sunrise, grain moved against stone. Someone knelt over a heavy slab and pressed a hand stone through dry kernels. The motion was simple, forward, then back. Coarse meal gathered in the hollow. Pale dust clung to the hands and drifted into the darkened room. The work might continue for hours, and it would begin again on another morning. Beyond the houses, cultivated grain promised something powerful. It could be harvested in quantity, dried, stored, and eaten long after the plants had turned brown. A community no longer had to depend entirely on food encountered along seasonal routes. Part of the future could be gathered in advance and kept behind walls. But this new security created dangers of its own. A crop demanded labor before it produced anything. Seed placed in the ground could no longer be eaten. Rain might fail. Animals could enter a field. Grain could be damaged before harvest or lost after it was stored. Moisture, insects, rodents, or fire could destroy months of work concentrated in one place. Houses, roofs, containers, tools, and cultivated ground all required attention if the harvest was to remain useful. The settlement offered a more dependable supply of food only by creating new forms of dependence. And still, people stayed. They repaired the same houses, protected the same stores, returned to the same ground, and taught another generation the movements required to keep the system alive. Familiar paths connected homes with fields, water, fuel, and animals. Each return made the settlement more useful, but also made departure more costly. This is the central mystery of agriculture. Why did communities continue investing in a way of life that could demand harder repetitive labor, expose them to concentrated failure, narrow parts of the diet, and sometimes leave individual bodies less healthy than those of people relying on a broader range of wild foods? The answer cannot begin with the idea that farming was simply discovered and immediately recognized as superior. There was no single moment when one complete way of life was abandoned and another was deliberately chosen. Hunting, gathering, fishing, and seasonal movement continued beside cultivation for long periods. Early communities responded to local conditions, often combining different sources of food rather than committing themselves at once to fields and herds. In some places, people were already returning to favorable locations so often that the difference between a camp and a settlement began to weaken. Structures were repaired. Food was processed and stored. Heavy objects remained where they were useful. Knowledge accumulated around particular water sources, soils, plants, and seasons. Cultivation could begin within this older pattern. People might protect useful stands, clear competing growth, scatter seed, or plant collected grain near places they already occupied. None of these acts required a plan to transform human society. They answered immediate needs: food closer to home, a reserve against shortage, a harvest that could be watched and stored. Over generations, however, repeated choices could alter both plants and people. Communities invested more labor in the same ground. Stored food required protection. Houses and tools gained value because they were already in place. A field represented work whose reward would arrive only if someone remained long enough to harvest it. None of this made departure impossible. Settlements could be abandoned, and cultivation could be reduced when conditions changed. Mobile practices and wild foods remained essential in many communities. But leaving now meant surrendering more than a temporary shelter. It could mean walking away from stored grain, repaired walls, prepared soil, familiar paths, and labor whose value belonged to that location. The change was gradual enough that no generation needed to understand where it would lead. One season's practical decision became the starting point for the next. A store built for security required maintenance. A field cleared for convenience encouraged another sowing. A house repaired because it already existed made returning more likely. Agriculture did not begin as a completed system waiting to be accepted or rejected. It emerged through arrangements that could remain flexible for centuries, even as the balance between movement and settlement slowly shifted. The oldest routes were not forgotten, and another choice still existed beyond the fields. Yet each morning now began with work tied to this place, this harvest, and the season that would follow. Before daylight reached the settlement, grain moved against stone. Cultivation and domestication are not the same thing. Cultivation is something people do. They clear ground, sow seed, protect plants, remove competing growth, or direct water toward a chosen patch. Domestication is a biological change that develops gradually within the plants themselves. Early cultivators could sow wild cereals that still scattered their seeds naturally when ripe. This helped the plants reproduce, but it made harvesting difficult because much of the grain fell before it could be collected. Some plants, however, held their seeds more firmly. When people cut and carried ripe stalks, these non-shattering plants were more likely to reach the settlement intact. If grain from that harvest was later sown, plants that retained their seeds could slowly become more common. Repeated harvesting and planting could therefore alter a crop without anyone planning the transformation. Over generations, some cereals became easier for people to gather but less capable of spreading without human help. Communities began relying on plants that increasingly relied on them in return. A cultivated patch offered greater control, but only if seed had been saved and people remained nearby long enough to tend and harvest it. A successful crop encouraged planting again. A failed one could make the next season more dangerous. The future was beginning to depend on particular ground. Archaeological sites preserve this transition not as a sudden event, but as a long sequence. Abu Huraira, once located beside the Euphrates in what is now Syria, provides one of the clearest examples. Excavated before the area was flooded by a dam, the settlement contained layers spanning profound changes in food production and daily life. Its earlier inhabitants relied on varied wild plants and hunted animals. Over time, the evidence suggests more intensive use of selected plants, cultivation, and eventually greater dependence on domesticated crops and managed animals. The layers do not reveal one moment when farming began. They reveal adjustment. Resources changed. Certain plants became more important. Storage increased. Buildings and patterns of settlement changed. What archaeologists can now examine as a long transformation would have been experienced one season at a time. Storage made this transformation more durable. Grain gathered during harvest could carry a household through winter or a dry period, but it also had to be protected from moisture, insects, rodents, and fire. Pits, containers, roofs, heavy tools, and cultivated ground represented labor fixed in one place. The settlement did not physically trap its inhabitants, but the value accumulated within it made departure increasingly costly. This did not mean hunting and gathering disappeared. For long periods, communities combined cultivation with wild plants, fishing, hunting, seasonal movement, and early forms of animal management. Mixed subsistence was not simply an unfinished stage waiting to become agriculture. It was often a resilient strategy. Cultivated grain could provide a concentrated supply while wild foods and hunted animals reduced dependence on a single source. Different communities followed different paths. Developments in the Levant were not identical to those in northern Mesopotamia, the Zagros, or Anatolia, and food production later emerged independently in several parts of the world. There was no universal point of origin and no single sequence followed everywhere. Some settlements were abandoned. Some communities relocated or returned to greater reliance on wild resources. Cultivation could be reduced as well as expanded. Agriculture was not yet inevitable. But the balance between leaving and remaining was changing. A house altered the value of staying. A storage pit altered the value of the harvest. A cultivated patch altered the value of nearby soil and water. A heavy tool altered the cost of departure. At early Jericho, substantial stone construction shows how deeply some communities had begun investing labor in permanent places. Whatever the exact purpose of those structures, the effort placed into them could not travel with their builders. The same process occurred more quietly around ordinary houses. Walls were repaired. Tools accumulated. Seed was saved. Familiar land was worked again. Local knowledge deepened with this repeated use. People learned how particular soils responded to rain, where grain kept best, and which patches produced reliable plants. Much of that knowledge belonged to the surrounding landscape. Moving elsewhere meant beginning again in less familiar country. Permanent settlements also depended on cooperation. Building, storing, harvesting, and caring for dependents connected people through repeated obligations. The surviving remains cannot tell us exactly how every household was organized, but leaving a settlement could mean leaving relationships that helped make life there possible. Settled communities may also have been able to support more dependent children in some circumstances because families no longer had to carry every possession and child through repeated long journeys. The pattern varied, and settlement did not automatically improve health, but even gradual growth could increase the amount of food and labor required. The decisive change was cumulative commitment. No one needed to choose an entire agricultural future. A community cleared another patch, prepared another store, repaired another wall, or remained for one additional season. The older routes remained known, and settlements could still be abandoned. But houses, stored grain, cultivated soil, heavy tools, local knowledge, and relationships now concentrated years of labor in one place. Leaving remained possible. It was simply no longer a return to a life untouched by agriculture. It meant surrendering part of the security that previous seasons had created. Staying carried a daily price. Before daylight reached the fields, the settlement was already returning to its unfinished work. Grain had to be processed, stores inspected, tools repaired, water collected, animals watched, and cultivated ground prepared for another season. These were not isolated duties. They formed a calendar in which the value of one task depended on the completion of the next. Agriculture did not merely add several new duties to an older life. It created connected sequences of work whose timing could not easily be postponed. Before anything green appeared, cultivated ground might have to be cleared or reopened after the previous season. Stones, shrubs, and unwanted growth were removed according to local conditions. Soil could be loosened with digging tools or planted with relatively little disturbance. Methods differed, but the land required preparation before it offered a return. Tools also demanded attention. Wooden handles split. Flint edges dulled. Baskets and cords wore through. The materials needed to repair them had to be gathered before work in the field could continue. Then part of the stored harvest was placed back into the earth. Seed reserved for sowing could not feed anyone that day. Too little saved grain reduced the next crop. Too much could leave people short before the harvest returned. The decision depended on supplies, weather, and expectations that could never be certain. Rain might arrive late. Cold or heat could damage young plants. Insects, birds, wild animals, or wandering livestock could reduce a field. Archaeology cannot recover the precise worries of an individual household, but the system itself reveals the risk. Food was being committed to a future that might not reward the effort. Once the crop emerged, work continued. Other plants competed for space and moisture. Some could be gathered and used, while others had to be controlled. Fields also had to be protected from animals drawn to concentrated green growth. Managed animals added another rhythm of obligation. Sheep, goats, or other livestock, where they were present, required access to water and grazing. Enclosures had to be maintained, movement controlled, and vulnerable animals watched. Animal management developed differently between places and periods, and hunting continued beside it. Yet the basic demand was constant: animals needed care on days when other work was already urgent. As the season advanced, months of effort narrowed toward harvest. Grain left too long might fall, be damaged by rain, or be consumed by birds and rodents. Cutting therefore had to proceed while the crop was ready, even when water collection, repairs, and animal care demanded attention elsewhere. The harvested crop was still not food. Grain had to be carried, separated from stalks and chaff, cleaned, dried, sorted, and stored. Baskets placed repeated weight on shoulders, backs, hips, and knees as harvests, water, and fuel moved along familiar paths. The distances could be modest. The repetition was not. Human remains from early farming communities sometimes preserve traces consistent with demanding habitual labor. Archaeologists have observed patterns of joint wear, spinal stress, muscular development, and injury that may reflect carrying, digging, kneeling, harvesting, and grinding. A single mark on a skeleton cannot identify one exact movement. Age, terrain, illness, diet, and many kinds of activity shaped the body. But when skeletal evidence is considered beside tools, grinding stones, buildings, and processed crops, it reveals lives organized around repeated physical tasks. Settlement had reduced some forms of long-distance movement while multiplying journeys made again and again within the same landscape. Settlement had reduced some forms of long-distance movement while multiplying journeys made again and again within the same landscape. Grinding was one of the clearest examples of the new repetition. Stored grain was durable, but it often had to be crushed before it could become bread, porridge, or another prepared food. The handstone moved across the slab hundreds and thousands of times while the body remained bent or kneeling. The worn stone preserves the motion. Teeth sometimes preserve its consequences. Tiny fragments could break from the grinding surface and enter the flour. Over years, this grit contributed to severe dental wear in some communities. Greater reliance on carbohydrate-rich cereal foods also created conditions in which tooth decay could become more common. The pattern was not identical everywhere. Hunter-gatherers also experienced dental disease, and diets varied widely between farming settlements. Yet in many populations, the growing importance of grain altered the mouth as clearly as repetitive work altered the skeleton. The rest of the body could reveal nutritional stress. Some early farming populations show signs associated with interrupted growth, dietary deficiency, or periods of hardship. A few productive crops might provide abundant calories while offering less variety than a broad mixture of wild plants and animal foods. Other farming communities retain diverse diets through legumes, fruits, gathered plants, fishing, hunting, livestock, and exchange. Agriculture did not produce one universal decline in health. It created uneven possibilities. A settlement might obtain more food from the surrounding land while some of its inhabitants ate a narrower diet. Storage rooms could be full, yet individual bodies could still record shortage or deficiency. More food did not always mean better nourishment. Permanent settlement also created conditions in which illness could spread more easily. People remained close to one another, smoke and waste accumulated near houses, and water sources were repeatedly visited by humans and animals. Many infections leave no clear trace on bone, and the great animal-derived epidemics of later history should not be projected automatically into the earliest villages. Even so, crowding, contaminated food or water, parasites, and close contact with livestock increased the opportunities for disease. A permanent settlement gathered people and resources together. It also had to manage the consequences of keeping them in one place. Permanent houses were not completed achievements. Plaster cracked, roofs weakened, gaps admitted rodents, and rain could damage grain intended to last through winter. Wells, pathways, storage rooms, ovens, tools, and enclosures offered security only while people maintained them. Water and fuel also had to be gathered regardless of the season's other demands. These duties might occur away from the fields, but they remained part of the agricultural system. Without water, fuel, secure storage, and working tools, the next cycle could not continue. Crop failure threatened more than the meals of one season. It could consume seed reserved for sowing, reduce fodder, and weaken the next agricultural cycle before another crop entered the ground. Wild foods, hunting, exchange, and assistance from neighbors could soften the loss. But a large settled population could not always return entirely to surrounding wild resources. Agriculture concentrated production in fields and stores. It concentrated failure there as well. Stored grain could carry a village through cold, drought, or temporary scarcity. Yet someone still had to decide what would be eaten, what would remain as seed, and who would receive support during shortage. Archaeology rarely reveals exactly who controlled these resources, and differences between buildings or possessions do not prove modern ownership or rigid classes. But stores, land, livestock, and tools could be shared, guarded, transferred, or withheld. By fixing resources in one place, the village could preserve material differences as well as food. Cooperation remained essential. Harvesting, construction, animal care, food processing, and survival during poor seasons often required shared labor. The evidence does not reveal one universal division of work, but it does reveal interdependence. Shared work made the settlement stronger than any household acting alone. It also created obligations involving labor, tools, animals, land, and stored food. The relationships that made village life more secure could therefore make individual households more dependent on the community. Yet village life was not a continuous catalogue of suffering. Permanent homes offered genuine security, shelter remained ready, grain survived beyond the harvest, possessions no longer accompanied every movement, and shared labor accomplished work beyond the strength of one household. Attachment to such a place was not irrational. Its fields, stores, walls, paths, and accumulated knowledge were visible evidence that earlier seasons had been survived. But the same system that created this security continued to press upon individual bodies. Hands ground grain until stone surfaces became smooth. Backs carried water and harvests. Knees bent beside fields, hearths, and grinding slabs. Teeth consumed dependable food that could also wear and decay them. Health outcomes differed greatly between settlements. Some communities had varied diets, productive soil, reliable water, and strong networks of support. Others faced repeated shortages or environments where infections spread more easily. Agriculture did not make every farmer sick, overworked, or poorly fed. The evidence reveals something more complex. The experience of the individual could worsen while the capacity of the settlement increased. A person might perform more repetitive labor or live with greater exposure to infection. A household might possess fewer reserves than its neighbors. A season of hunger might leave marks on growing bodies. At the same time, the village could preserve larger stores, maintain permanent structures, support more dependents, and retain knowledge within a community that remained in place. A household might suffer. The system could continue. That was the reversal hidden inside the agricultural year. Every stage protected the value of an earlier stage. Harvest justified sowing. Storage protected harvest. Buildings protected storage. Water, fuel, tools, animals, and cooperation sustained the people who would sow again. The work formed a circle. Once established, it had to keep moving. As evening settled, the cultivated ground beyond the houses faded into darkness. Inside, grain shifted softly as someone reached into a container. A final portion was poured beside the grinding slab, ready for morning. The settlement had survived another day. But the mystery had become sharper. This way of life could demand harder labor, expose people to illness and concentrated failure, and still strengthen the settlement they maintained. Houses were repaired, grain was stored, fields were planted again, and children learned the work that kept the system alive. Why did communities continue reproducing it, and why did this demanding way of life eventually expand across so much of the human world? The answer lies in a distinction that individual bodies alone cannot reveal. Agriculture did not need to make every person healthier or more comfortable. Under many conditions, it allowed an entire community to preserve food, support dependents, recover from difficult seasons, and pass the system to more descendants. One reason was their capacity to support more dependent children. Highly mobile communities faced practical limits. Infants, young children, food, tools, and possessions had to move together. Permanent shelter reduced part of that burden. Stored grain could be prepared into foods suitable for young children, while relatives and neighbors could share care as others worked nearby. These conditions may sometimes have shortened the interval between births and allowed more children to survive within the community. They did not guarantee good health or low mortality. Early farming populations still faced hunger, infection, and nutritional stress. The important difference was demographic. Even when individual health declined, the total population could grow. A farming village did not need every inhabitant to live longer or more comfortably than a neighboring forager. Across generations, it needed only to support more surviving descendants. This slowly changed the balance between different ways of life. The second advantage concerned land. Foraging could provide varied food and, in favorable environments, require less repetitive labor than cultivation. But mobile communities often depended on broad seasonal territories and resources scattered across them. Agriculture concentrated food production. A cultivated field could require digging, sowing, tending, harvesting, processing, and storage. The labor invested in each portion of food could be high. Yet a restricted area, managed repeatedly, could support more people than it had through wild resources alone. The result was not always more food for every hour worked. It was often more food from the same territory. This depended on soil, rainfall, crops, water, tools, and local ecology. Some fields failed, while some coasts, wetlands, and forests supported dense foraging populations without cultivation. Agriculture was never universally more productive. But where harvests were reliable, cultivation allowed a growing population to remain within a limited landscape. Hunting and gathering continued within farming societies and often remained essential. Yet a large village could not necessarily abandon its fields and survive entirely from nearby wild resources. There were now too many people for an easy return. The settlement had produced a population that increasingly required the system supporting it. Storage gave that system continuity. A harvest could be divided between present meals, future supplies, animal fodder, exchange, and seed. Grain preserved from one season could sustain people after fresh resources had disappeared. Stored food also supported those who could not produce a full share of it, including children, older people, and injured workers. It could feed groups carrying out construction or other tasks that offered no immediate meal. Surplus did not eliminate risk. A store could spoil, burn, be stolen, or be controlled unequally. A poor harvest could still bring hunger. Yet when storage worked, it allowed a community to carry the result of one season into the next. Storage gave the settlement a memory longer than one season. The same was true of its physical surroundings. Later generations inherited fields already cleared, houses already standing, tools already shaped, paths already known, and land already altered by cultivation. In some places, they also inherited wells or other forms of water management, though these were never universal features of early farming. A child born in such a settlement did not enter an untouched landscape and choose freely between farming and foraging. The surrounding world was already organized around cultivated plants, managed animals, storage, and permanent residence. Knowledge came with that world. Children learned when to sow, where animals could graze, how grain was stored, and which soils held moisture. Continued farming became easier than rebuilding an entirely different way of life elsewhere. This was not biological destiny. Human beings did not lose the ability to hunt, gather, move, or change strategies. Agricultural settlements were abandoned, and communities repeatedly altered their economies. But farming possessed cultural and material momentum. The fields already existed. The population needed food. The tools and routines were designed for cultivation. The knowledge held by the community prepared people for another agricultural year. As farming populations grew, the system moved beyond existing settlements. Some communities migrated and founded new villages. Others adopted crops, animals, tools, or storage practices from their neighbors without accepting an entire agricultural economy at once. Exchange, intermarriage, and imitation carried knowledge and domesticated species between groups. Mixed ways of life remained common. People might cultivate while hunting, fishing, or moving seasonally. Farming expansion was therefore not one continuous migration or conquest. At times, growing populations competed over productive land and water, leading to negotiation, movement, displacement, or violence. But the evidence does not support a single military advance in which farmers simply swept aside passive foragers. Many foraging communities resisted agriculture, adopted only selected elements, or continued their own ways of life for thousands of years. Farming paused at ecological boundaries, failed in unsuitable environments, and developed independently in several regions of the world. Its spread was uneven. Yet wherever farming communities consistently supported larger populations, a powerful reversal became possible. Imagine two neighboring systems. The first supports a smaller population with a varied diet and, during many seasons, less repetitive labor. Its members may be highly skilled, mobile, and relatively healthy. The second demands more work and exposes its inhabitants to the risks of crowding, crop dependence, and narrower diets. But it produces enough food from its territory to support a larger community and more children. The first system may offer a better life to many individuals. The second may create more individuals. Across a few years, the difference might hardly be visible. Across generations, it could transform a region. The decisive comparison was not simply between one farmer and one forager. It was between systems with different capacities to produce food, support descendants, occupy territory, preserve resources, and reproduce themselves. Agriculture should not be described as defeating foraging because it represented a more advanced or intelligent life. Foraging societies continued to adapt successfully in many environments. Farming expanded because, under certain conditions, it generated the means of its own continuation. More food from a restricted territory could support more people. More people needed more cultivated land. Larger fields required seed, labor, storage, and tools. Those investments made the next harvest increasingly necessary. The system strengthened the conditions that kept it alive. Larger populations and stored resources also created new possibilities. Some people could devote more time to crafts, exchange, communal construction, ritual, defense, or coordination. These developments were gradual. The first farmers did not immediately create cities, states, armies, taxation, writing, or rigid social classes. Such institutions appeared much later and only under particular conditions. Agriculture created foundations, not predetermined outcomes. A concentrated population could organize larger projects, but accumulated resources could also support inequality. Cooperation might become compulsory, and differences in access to land, animals, or stored food could deepen. Agriculture did not automatically produce hierarchy or warfare. Yet concentrated food and labor created new opportunities for some people to direct the resources of others. None of this was chosen at the beginning. There was no moment when a community compared the distant future of agriculture with the distant future of foraging and deliberately selected harder labor, crowding, dependence, and inequality. The decisions were smaller. Store grain. Cultivate useful plants. Protect a field. Save seed. Repair a house. Feed a growing community. Plant again. Each action answered an immediate problem. Together, they created a system whose full consequences appeared only across generations. By the time those consequences became visible, the settlement already contained people who depended on another harvest. Fields had to be planted because the population had grown. Stores had to be filled because food was needed between seasons. Houses sheltered people, grain, tools, and accumulated possessions. The next agricultural cycle was not merely a tradition. It had become the practical condition of continued life. Settlements could still be abandoned, and communities could return to broader mixtures of hunting, gathering, herding, and cultivation. But large populations, occupied territories, and inherited knowledge made complete departure increasingly difficult. Farming continued because its advantages and burdens had become inseparable. Fields demanded labor but fed more people. Stores created vulnerability but carried food across seasons. Permanent settlement concentrated illness and social pressure while preserving shelter, cooperation, knowledge, and care. Agriculture was not universally better for individuals. It was extraordinarily effective at creating more agricultural communities. Some villages failed, but the wider system endured whenever enough communities survived, grew, and established others. No one who began this transformation could see its final shape. Each generation saw only the next practical need. Morning returns to the settlement. Before the sunlight reaches the fields, grain moves against stone. The sound is low and familiar. The handstone passes forward and returns. Pale dust gathers along the polished slab. The person performing this work does not need to understand the demographic or historical forces surrounding the task. The grain will feed the present community. Some will remain in storage. Some may be saved as seed. Children will watch the movement and learn to repeat it. Beyond the houses, the fields are waiting. Another patch may be cleared. Another house may be built. Another season of work will begin. No person or generation planned the world that followed. The agricultural transformation was not a simple story of progress, stupidity, coercion, or one brilliant invention. It was a system assembled through practical decisions that solved immediate problems while creating new obligations. That system could make individual life harder. But it enabled agricultural communities to support more descendants, preserve more resources, occupy more territory, and reproduce themselves across generations. Farming transformed the human world not because it always made people healthier, freer, or happier, but because it allowed their communities to grow, endure, expand, and build the conditions for farming to continue.